since the horrific acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on 7 October 23, more than 40,000 Palestinians and over 1,600 Israelis and foreign nationals have been killed. 109 Israelis are still held in Gaza, and the ones alive deny humanitarian visit. Tens of thousands of people have been injured, and vast majority of them Palestinians, including a staggering number of women and children. In Gaza, incidents of mass civilian casualties, airstrikes by Israel on schools and mosques sheltering the displaced, and the wanton destruction of civilian infrastructure are fueling suffering and violence, which is reverberating throughout the broader region. The indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other groups towards population centers in Israel continues. Civilian objects, including infrastructure and UN premises, are also reportedly being used to shield fighters and military objectives, endangering the lives of civilians around them. The lives of the remaining hostages are at grave risk. Many Palestinians in Gaza feel they have nowhere safe left to turn. Over the past months, around 200,000 Palestinians have been affected by evacuation orders. This is merely the latest round of a mass displacement in Gaza, where nearly 2 million people have been forced out of their homes and shelters during the war, most of them multiple times. 85% of the Strip has come under evacuation orders since 7 October. Mr. President, despite facing overwhelming challenges, UN agencies and humanitarian organizations continue to deliver life-saving assistance with remarkable courage through all available crossing points. However, their efforts are jeopardized by unsafe conditions on the ground, which are exacerbated by a complete breakdown of law and order. If these unacceptable conditions are allowed to prevail, humanitarian operations in Gaza will continue to fall short of meeting the massive needs of the population. Mr. President, the scale of destruction is immense, and it will take years, if not decades, to recover. The UN is working to repair and improve almost entirely defunct water, sanitation and hygiene systems in Gaza. The 5 wastewater treatment plants have shut down, and 5 out of 6 solid waste management facilities are damaged. The Palestinian Ministry of Health just confirmed the first cases of polio in 25 years. 1.6 million doses of polio vaccine have been released for a campaign scheduled to begin on 31st of August. The UN estimates nearly 40 million tons of debris have been generated in this conflict. Clearing the debris from key areas alone is estimated to take at least 5 years. Mr. President, while the eyes of the international community are focused on Gaza, the occupied West Bank is a tinderbox of violence and tension. Israeli security forces continue to carry out large-scale operations in Area A, including targeting Hamas, PIJ and other armed groups in densely populated refugee camps and Palestinian urban centers. These operations often result in lethal exchanges with these groups, in adding to the killing or injuring of bystanders. Fatal attacks by Palestinian militants on Israelis in the West Bank and in Israel continued, including a failed bombing attack claimed by Hamas and PIJ in Tel Aviv on 19 August. The Israeli settler rampage in the Palestinian village of Yit near Nablus that killed 1 Palestinian, critically injured others on 15 August was yet another illustration of the violent consequences of settlement expansions in the occupied West Bank and the persistent lack of accountability for such crimes. Inflammatory rhetoric and provocative acts are further inflaming the situation. In recent days, we have seen Hamas threaten to launch a new campaign of suicide bombings. We have also seen 2 Israeli ministers, alongside hundreds of Israelis, visit the Holy Esplanade on the Jewish holiday of Tish B'Av. Let me be clear. If we are to prevent yet another spiraling escalation, the violence must end. There are no justification for acts of terror, civilians must be protected, and the incitement must stop. Any violation of the status quo at the holy sites must also be firmly rejected. Mr. President, the war in Gaza and the deteriorating situation in the occupied West Bank are continuing in the context of a wider regional tension and the threat of even more serious escalation. Across the blue line and beyond, exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah continue to intensify, particularly following the recent strike at Mashd al-Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan, while resulted in the killing of 12 children, followed by a subsequent strike in the southern suburbs of Beirut that killed a senior Hezbollah commander. In the wider region, several fatal events exacerbated tension. Aerial attacks towards Israel from various locations across the region that Israel has attributed to Iran-backed forces, including a Houthi drone strike in Tel Aviv, Israeli strike that targeted Hudaydah port infrastructure in response, and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas Politburo in Tehran. Mr. President, with all of these negative trends, and after more than 300 days of war in Gaza, we are at an inflection point in the Middle East. A ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza is imperative now for regional peace and security. I have continued to emphasize that message in support of regional de-escalation in discussions with all relevant parties and member states in the region, including Lebanon, Egypt, and Qatar. I commend the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and US, for their continued relentless efforts in Doha and in Cairo this week. I urge the parties to reach a deal in the coming days. There is simply no time to lose. The UN remain committed and ready to scale up humanitarian assistance during a ceasefire and supporting implementation of a deal. Only a sustained ceasefire can enable a full-scale humanitarian and early recovery response in Gaza. Mr. President, the profound social, economic, and political fallout from the devastation is yet to be seen and comprehended. We must work to put in place, as soon as possible, the political and security framework necessary to more ably address the humanitarian crisis, start early recovery, and eventually rebuild Gaza, as well as changing the negative dynamic at the West Bank. These political and security frameworks, even ones that are considered transitional, cannot be divorced from the context of the ongoing Israeli occupation and unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are no shortcuts and no quick fixes. Security and governance are intrinsically linked and must be addressed in tandem to achieve a lasting peace in Gaza and address the West Bank situation. It is imperative that we establish a comprehensive political framework that is accepted by Palestinian population and addresses the legitimate aspirations and grievances while also addressing Israel's legitimate security concern. The UN will strongly support this work. This framework must facilitate a Palestinian government that can effectively govern both Gaza and the occupied West Bank and ensure stability and security across the occupied Palestinian territory. The Palestinian Authority must be at the center of governance in the occupied Palestinian territory. There is simply no credible alternative. However, to achieve this and to promote a more durable and credible model of governance to ensure stability and security for Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians and Israelis, steps must be taken by all parties and by the international community to strengthen and support the PA. Violence in the occupied West Bank needs to be significantly reduced, including violence taking place in the context of scaled-up Israeli security operations. Palestinian security forces need to be supported and empowered to carry out their responsibility fully. Israeli measures that weaken the PA need to be urgently addressed, including IDF operations in Area A, settlement expansion, settler violence, and extreme financial pressure. The international community must work together to address the PA's persistent financial crisis, strengthen its capacity, and enable its return to Gaza. Recent commitments from the World Bank and the European Union offer the promise of relief, but will not resolve the precarity of the PA's financial situation. We must work together to strengthen the ability of the PA to meet the needs of their people. Most importantly, for any of these efforts to be credible and durable, a political horizon must be re-established. Security fixes alone will not lead to a more stable future for anyone in the region. But let us not be naive about what is required. It will take concerted effort from committed leaders from the region and the international community. It may also require us to rethink how we get there. The steps I've outlined above, which are informed by the principles I outlined to you in May, are a start. Mr. President, finally, ultimately the only path of these vicious circles of despair is a political horizon that will end the occupation and achieve a two-state solution. Israel and an independent, democratic, continuous, viable and sovereign Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security with secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-67 lines with Jerusalem as the capital of both. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards this goal. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Windsland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Louisa Baxter.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, I'm speaking to you today from Gaza, where I'm a doctor working with Save the Children's Emergency Health Unit. For 320 days, children in Gaza have endured relentless bombardment, displacement, siege, and death. In that time, their needs have risen exponentially, as have restrictions on our ability to meet them. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 1% of the total child population, 14,000 children, have been killed, and this is likely to be a gross underestimate. Outside this room, Mr. President, I am surrounded by overwhelming destruction. More than 1.9 million people have been displaced and are moving through streets filled with rubble, rubbish, and wastewater. The bodies of at least 10,000 people, many of them children, remain lost under the rubble. Just yesterday, a so-called evacuation order was issued for Deir el-Balah, where I'm sitting now. Overnight, thousands of people have been displaced and are looking for shelter and safety. Clinics, humanitarian warehouses, and supply hubs, all inaccessible. Our medical teams have seen over 13,000 people in our clinics. The children we're seeing are showing signs of profound trauma. Common childhood illnesses have been made worse by malnutrition, lack of water, and the absence of medications. Supplies of antibiotics, pain relief, and even fridges for vaccines have been blocked by the government of Israel. We are seeing the willful and repeated obstruction of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. My team has been waiting for life-saving medications for 4 months. They are held at the crossing gates by a myriad of rules and restrictions, many of them unwritten and arbitrary. In locations where we operate, families have been forced to relocate up to 10 times due to ongoing violence or so-called evacuation orders. With each displacement, the risk of separation from families, risks from injuries, illness, and death multiply. Let me be clear today, Mr. President, nowhere in Gaza is safe. Our protection teams are working with children released from the Israeli military detention system. These children report sexual violence, including rape. They report being denied food, beaten and attacked by dogs. They report seeing their parents stripped and beaten in front of them. These children are struggling to cope with the profound trauma and mental and physical harm that this has caused. There are Israeli hostages remaining in Gaza, and disturbingly little is known about their whereabouts or treatment. Excellencies, there is now a confirmed polio outbreak in Gaza. The first confirmed case, a 10-month-old baby in Deir el-Balah, is an individual tragedy, and at the same time, a sign of a larger looming catastrophe. Polio is a highly infectious virus and can infect anyone at any age, However, those most at risk are children under 5. For every 200 children who become infected, one will suffer irreversible paralysis. Polio is easily prevented by a safe and effective vaccine. At least 50,000 children born in Gaza since October 23 are unlikely to have had any of their childhood vaccinations. Older children, their brothers and sisters, have had their regular childhood vaccination schedules severely disrupted. Polio mostly spreads by water, particularly wastewater, which is now everywhere in Gaza. The government of Israel has destroyed the water and sanitation infrastructure, whilst effectively shutting off clean water from entering the Strip. It is this drop in population immunity, combined with dire public health and environmental conditions, that has allowed polio to re-emerge. This decimated health system is wholly unprepared to face this new polio crisis, with over 750 health staff killed since October 23 and less than a quarter of hospitals remaining functional. Unless preventative action is taken immediately, this polio outbreak will not only be a disaster for children in Gaza, but may substantially set back global eradication efforts. Mr. President, polio anywhere is a threat to children everywhere. And as we speak, polio is spreading in Gaza, and it will not wait at the inspection gates of Kerem Shalom or the customs desks at Ben Gurion Airport. Let us be clear, we should not need negotiations or special permissions to bring in life-saving medical supplies for civilians. Humanitarians and medical teams like my own should not spend almost a year pleading for the rules of war to be upheld by parties to the conflict. Urgent action to protect children in Gaza should not only come when the harm they face poses risks beyond their borders. There is a legal, a normative, and a moral obligation on all parties of the conflict to facilitate humanitarian and medical access to the full extent needed by the population. And it is the responsibility of every member state, including the 15 at this council, to assure these rights are met. Excellencies, to effectively respond to the polio outbreak, 2 sustained cessations of hostilities, no less than 1 week for each phase, must commence immediately. This time frame assumes that all attacks on humanitarian and medical personnel end now and end permanently. Aid groups must be able to move across Gaza without obstruction. Parents must be able to bring children to vaccination points in safety. Any cessation of hostilities must consist of full consecutive days with conditions publicly stated and shared with all communities. Compliance must be monitored with robust accountability from this council. We must use this opportunity not just for vaccines, but to provide Gaza with humanitarian assistance at scale. Ultimately, the only way to comprehensively address the vast multitude of needs in Gaza is through an immediate and sustainable ceasefire. If the parties to conflict cannot agree and implement a ceasefire, then it falls to this council and its member state to demand and enforce one, including by adopting measures to halt the transfer of weapons to the government of Israel and Palestinian armed groups. Regardless of the status of a ceasefire, full, unhindered humanitarian access into and within the Gaza Strip is essential for all humanitarian supplies and personnel like myself. Mr. President, we have collectively failed the children of Gaza for 320 days. I ask this Council and its member states in their national capacities to take immediate and decisive action. Excellencies, we leave this in your hands.
I thank Dr. Baxter for a briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make a statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Coordinator Winsland and Dr. Baxter for your briefings. Colleagues, Secretary Blinken just concluded his 9th visit to the region since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th and unleashed a war that has caused so much suffering and devastation. The Secretary reaffirmed the United States' ironclad support for Israel's security, but he also aimed to advance discussions on a comprehensive ceasefire and hostage release deal that now is in sight. and to emphasize that no one in the region should take any action that would undermine ongoing negotiations. While the Secretary was in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed that Israel accepts the bridging proposal that the United States, Qatar, and Egypt put forward last week. The proposal is consistent with the principles outlined by President Biden in May 2024, and that this Council endorsed in Resolution 2735. And this builds on areas of agreement from talks convened in Doha last week and bridges the remaining gaps in a manner that allows for swift implementation of the deal. We appreciate this Council's support for the efforts the United States, Qatar, and Egypt have made to help get this deal done. We now have a path forward to save lives, bring relief to the people of Gaza, get the hostages back home, and de-escalate regional tensions. Again, Israel has accepted the bridging proposal. Now Hamas must do the same. As members of this Council, we must speak with one voice, and we must use our leverage to press Hamas to accept the bridging proposal, which includes massive and immediate benefits for the Palestinians in Gaza and incorporates a number of Hamas's earlier demands. Colleagues, this is a decisive moment. It's a decisive moment for ceasefire talks and for the region. And so every member of this Council should continue to send strong messages to other actors in the region to avoid actions that would move us away from finalizing this deal. At the same time, the United Nations and humanitarian agencies need to accelerate planning so that they can surge assistance into Gaza in the event of a ceasefire, while we all continue to press for increased humanitarian assistance now. We continue to work with the Israeli authorities to speed up clearances and remove restrictions so that Palestinian civilians can get much-needed food, medicine, shelter, clean water, and other essentials, including vaccines, as we just heard from Dr. Baxter. A disease like polio must be prevented from making a comeback in Gaza, and we urge Israel to continue working with humanitarian agencies to provide polio vaccinations for Palestinian civilians, particularly children in Gaza. This effort is urgent, and having a ceasefire deal will greatly facilitate the implementation of this crucial vaccination campaign. Colleagues, even as we press for a ceasefire and hostage releases in Gaza, we must also continue to speak out about the situation in the West Bank. I want to be clear. Actions in the West Bank that could escalate tensions at this fragile moment must stop. As the White House has made clear, attacks by violent settlers against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank are unacceptable and must stop. Israeli authorities must take measures to protect these communities from harm, including by intervening to stop such violence and by holding all perpetrators to account. It is also critical that Israel release all owed Palestinian Authority tax revenues on time. These funds are needed to pay PA salaries, provide essential services, ensure peace, security, and stability in the West Bank, all of which are key to Israel's security interests. Additionally, we remain concerned about Israel's West Bank settlement announcements and the legalization of outposts. The government of Israel's resettlement program is inconsistent with international law, and these unilateral actions are detrimental to the prospects of a two-state solution, which we have repeatedly said offers the only durable and secure path forward for Israelis and Palestinians. The suicide bombing in Tel Aviv on August 18th, which Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad claimed, was a stark reminder of Israel's very real security concerns. The United States unequivocally condemns this attack, as it does all acts of terrorism, and calls on the Security Council to do the same. Colleagues, this week I spoke with two individuals whose family members were murdered in cold blood by Hamas on October 7th. Irish Weinstein Hage, who lost both of her parents, and Judy and Gadi on that horrific day. And Ruby Chin, whose son Ite, a 19-year-old Israeli-American who was killed by Hamas. It is beyond heartbreaking and infuriating that the remains of Iris's and Ruby's loved ones are still being held by Hamas, as they have held the body of Hadara Golden since 2014, denying his family closure. Today, we again call on Hamas to release the remains of Judy, Gadi, Ite, Hartar, and all those still in Gaza immediately. And here's what's truly remarkable to me. Iris and Ruby have turned their immense pain into purpose by organizing and speaking out and lobbying for an agreement on a ceasefire and the release of hostages. During our call, Ruby invoked some of Martin Luther King's most powerful words. He reminded me of a quote, and I'll quote it here: "The fierce urgency of now." To me, that perfectly sums up the moment we find ourselves in and the task before us, as we also just heard from Special Coordinator Winsland. It is urgent. It is urgent that we secure a ceasefire and a hostage deal now. Not soon, but now, because families like Iris's and Ruby's desperately need closure, because the well-being of all hostages is in jeopardy, because Palestinians in Gaza are living under hellish conditions and are caught in the crosshairs of war, because there's very real danger of regional escalation. And so let us do everything in our power to get this ceasefire and hostage release deal over the finish line now. Let us be confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank the briefers. I want to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland, and I want to thank Dr. Baxter from the Save the Children, especially for her very chilling briefing. And I think that we are not humans if such briefings don't touch us. Mr. President, an ancient saying confirms that the first victim of the war is the truth. But the biggest victim of the war in Gaza will surely be children. The children of Gaza have gone through indescribable suffering, being deprived of adequate nutrition. They face a cycle of endless violence and repetitive displacement, without access to hospital care and psychological support. Over 20,000 children in Gaza are missing, lost, disappeared, detained, or buried. They have been orphaned, maimed, and killed at an unprecedented rate. Today, childhood in Gaza is a synonym for trauma. As a parent myself, I cannot imagine the suffering of parents not being able to provide their children a safe and carefree childhood, and not being able to shelter them from this trauma. In light of this immense suffering, Slovenia supports the Secretary General's appeal for a polio pause. As underlined by WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA, a humanitarian pause is crucial. It's crucial to allow for 2 rounds of vaccination campaigns to take place. These days of tranquility would enable children and families to reach health facilities and UN entities to carry out outreach. Successful campaigns will also require sufficient fuel, functional telecommunication networks, and cash. The requests of the health community are clear, and we therefore repeat our call for a humanitarian pause. This should also be the moment to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid and to carry out much-needed repairs to the health, water, and sanitation systems. The lack of safe drinking water is one of the biggest dangers caused by the destruction of critical infrastructure. Lack of clean water for adequate personal hygiene contributes to the risk of disease and infection, especially among women and children. It is a reality we knew was coming. Mr. President, a sobering milestone was reached last week, 40,000 fatalities of the war in Gaza. In recent days, we witnessed one of the biggest evacuation orders to date, further shrinking so-called humanitarian zones for civilians. And we heard today from both briefers there is no safe place in Gaza. While the humanitarian community continues to face a severely challenging environment, including the breakdown of law and order, we see an increase in denied humanitarian assistance missions and a decline in the volume of aid picked up. We are talking about another cycle of civilian suffering. To stop it, a lasting ceasefire must be reached. And we once again express our full support to the negotiators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to finalize the deal during the Cairo round of negotiations in the coming days, or as my US colleague said, to finish it now, but definitely within the next few days. Slovenia, as a Security Council member, stands ready to support the process with meaningful action in the Council. Mr. President, not many reasons for optimism were outlined in Mr. Venezuela's briefing. Negative trends cannot be prevented with further violence. We strongly condemn the latest suicide attack carried out by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Tel Aviv. Negative trends will not be stopped by further settlements. We call on Israel to reverse their settlement policy, including the plans for the first new West Bank settlement since 2017. Slovenia calls on Israel to comply with its duties and obligations under international law, as set out by the International Court of Justice in its provisional measures and in its advisory opinion, as well as in the relevant Security Council resolutions. We strongly condemn settler violence. Negative trends will not cease with inflammatory rhetoric and provocations, including the latest visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque. We condemn this violation of the holy site's status quo. And lastly, negative trends cannot be addressed without steps towards the two-state solution. They must be done on the ground, including through addressing the liquidity crisis in Palestine and strong support to the Palestinian Authority. They must also be done in this Council, with future-oriented discussions and decisive actions without delay. Mr. President, the region is on the brink, including along the Blue Line, in the Red Sea, and elsewhere in the region. We call for maximum restraint by all actors, refraining from further attacks and threatening rhetorics. Dr. Baxter concluded her statement with, "We are in your hands." And indeed, the whole international community is watching us, is watching the Council. At least we, Slovenia, feel this pressure, and we feel the duty and responsibility to do something, to act within the authority of this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Tor Venesland for his statement and Ms. Louisa Baxter for her
extraordinary testimony. We support the mediation efforts by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. These negotiations have to be finalized as soon as possible, and we call on the parties to make the compromises necessary to make sure that the war in Gaza stops, that humanitarian assistance is delivered at scale, and that the hostages can finally get back to their families. These are the messages that were delivered by the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Stefan Sejourné, and his UK counterpart during their joint visit to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory last week. An immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip is indispensable, urgent, to put an end to the suffering of the civilian population and allow for an upscale delivery and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance. We echo the concerns of the Secretary General when he spoke about the health situation and in particular the reemergence of polio in Gaza. We call on Israel to undertake all the measures necessary to allow for the vaccination of the population. In the context of extremely high tensions, we condemn any acts of provocation in Jerusalem as well as in West Bank. The Israeli authorities have the responsibility to uphold the historic status quo in the holy sites in Jerusalem. We underscore here the special role played by Jordan here. We ask Israel to undertake all of the necessary measures regarding the unacceptable attacks by the settlers against the civilian population in the West Bank. We renew our condemnation of the settlement policy. It runs counter to international law and is a major obstacle to peace. We reiterate our attachment to the security of Israel and condemn in the strongest possible words the barbaric attacks and the acts of violence on the 7th of October by Hamas and other terrorist groups. The rocket attacks against Israel are also unacceptable and must stop. The current situation recalls, if there were any need for that, the urgency of implementing the two-state solution is the only solution that can guarantee the stability and security of everyone in the region. We oppose any long-term occupation by Israel of the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, given the growing tensions in the Middle East, the Council has to do everything it can to make sure that there is no regional conflagration, and we continue our efforts in this regard together with our international regional partners. During his recent visit to Lebanon, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Stefan Sejourné, called for de-escalation and the end of clashes along the Blue Line. France reiterates its support to UNIFIL, whose action is indispensable, and calls for the Council to support the draft resolution to renew their mandate for 12 months. Mr. President, we can avoid a regional conflagration. Otherwise, it would have devastating consequences for the region. Iran and its allies must refrain from any and all attacks, as it would worsen the regional tensions and undermine the possibility of getting to a ceasefire and the release of hostages. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also wish to thank Coordinator Wennesland and Dr. Baxter for the information they provided. First and foremost, I wish to address the health situation in Gaza and the grave risk posed by the resurgence of polio, bearing in mind that illnesses which result from a lack of basic services, water and sanitation also claim many lives on a daily basis, particularly those of children. Any epidemic of a preventable disease is unacceptable. Consequently, Ecuador supports the United Nations initiative to organize a mass vaccination campaign to protect children in Gaza. It is urgent and of capital importance that parties provide safety guarantees without delay or excuses. Mr. President, as the Secretary General quite rightly stated, disease does not wait, and the only lasting vaccine against polio in this context is peace and an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. In this regard, I reiterate my country's support for the efforts which remain ongoing to reach an agreement which would allow an immediate ceasefire as well as the release of hostages and an improvement to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, including the vaccination campaign. The negotiations held last week in Doha and those that are to be conducted in the coming days in Cairo must culminate with a lasting agreement in line with Resolution 2735. For this to be achieved, it is vital, I repeat, vital, that we see political will and good faith on the part of the parties. It is unacceptable for obstacles and excuses to continue to appear. Stopping the war and halting the escalation of tensions in the region must be the priorities. The countries that have influence to bring to bear on each of the parties must make every possible effort to make an agreement possible, as the mediators have been doing. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, we continue to see violent attacks by settlers against Palestinian civilians. What happened last Thursday in the village of Jit is a disgrace, and those responsible must be brought to justice. Ecuador condemns all violence against civilians and recalls that civilians must be protected at all times. The norms and principles of international humanitarian law are to be complied with always and without exception. Moreover, terrorist activities continue to occur, such as the explosion of a suicide bomb in Tel Aviv this Sunday, which was claimed by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Ecuador condemns these acts just as we do the attacks of the 7th of October 2023 and the taking of hostages, which was the immediate cause of the current war. Violence only creates more violence, and it has in no way contributed to settling this dispute. This must now be patently clear to everyone in this and in all conflicts. Mr. President, I conclude this address by expressing the hope that I will soon receive the news that the parties have reached an agreement which allows a ceasefire and the release of hostages. I am convinced that the civilian population in Gaza, in Israel, and in the region in its entirety share that very same hope. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and Dr. Baxter of Save the Children for their briefings and for the tireless work of their teams. Gaza has become the deadliest place in the world to be a child. Women and children continue to bear the brunt of this brutal conflict that since October 7 has killed over 40,000 people. Children account for nearly a third of identified casualties. We call on Israel to take all possible steps to avoid civilian casualties. Over 100 innocent hostages remain captured by Hamas in Gaza. Time is running out for them as they remain in captivity, subject to unimaginable horror. We call again for their immediate and unconditional release. President, we've heard today that Gaza is on the brink of a devastating polio outbreak, another deadly threat to a people already facing a multitude of deadly threats, ongoing bombardment, risk of famine, and dire sanitary conditions. Meanwhile, regional tensions remain high. Any attack by Iran would have devastating consequences. Urgent action is needed on 3 fronts. First, we need an immediate ceasefire. All sides need to focus on the negotiations led by the US, Egypt, and Qatar. These talks offer a vital opportunity to secure an immediate ceasefire that ends the conflict, gets the hostages out, allows urgent access to aid, and de-escalates regional tensions. We also urge Iran, Lebanese Hezbollah, and other Iranian-aligned militia groups to stand down the ongoing threats of military escalation against Israel. All parties need to exercise restraint, as my Prime Minister has made clear in recent weeks. Second, Gaza stands on the precipice of a polio outbreak, with over 640,000 children under the age of 10 in need of vaccinations. We call on the parties to continue cooperating with the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and partners to facilitate vaccine rollouts. Israel needs to allow safe and unhindered aid access into and across Gaza, and to put in place an effective deconfliction mechanism to ensure aid and vaccines can be delivered and administered safely. Israel's ramping up of new evacuation orders is causing chaos in Gaza. The humanitarian zone, now just covering 11% of Gaza, is chronically overcrowded, with people desperately seeking shelter. It is not safe, and it is still receiving fire. British NGO UK Med reports that just last night, their residential compound in the humanitarian zone was damaged by Israeli shelling. Humanitarian actors are being forced to evacuate their offices and abandon warehouses full of aid. If this does not stop, a polio vaccine rollout may become impossible. All parties must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. Third, President, settler violence in the West Bank is inexcusable. The violence in the Palestinian village of Jit last week was abhorrent. We call on Israel to take action against these extremists. The UK has sanctioned 8 individuals and 2 entities related to settler violence. We condemn the continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank. It is a clear violation of international law. Finally, President, my Foreign Secretary and French Foreign Minister Séjourné visited Israel and the OPTs last week. They conveyed 3 key messages: that the current ceasefire talks were the only way to avert a full regional crisis, that the humanitarian situation was catastrophic and we needed to see immediate improvements, and that there had to be accountability for the appalling settler violence in the West Bank. I hope that we can all unite around these 3 messages today. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mr. Thor Wennesland, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Dr. Baxter, Operation Lead from the Save the Children's Emergency Health Unit in Gaza, for sharing insights into the challenging situation in Palestine. Mr. President, the war in the occupied Palestinian territories has reached a critical point with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. Many civilians have perished, and many innocent lives are at risk because of raging famine and illnesses. We call for an immediate end to the cycle of violence and full respect for the international law. In fact, our efforts to prevent regional escalation need to be stepped up. The protection of innocent civilians must be our priority. Therefore, an urgent, sustainable ceasefire is necessary to protect civilians, allow the hostage to return, and enable humanitarian aid delivery. Mr. President, as we celebrated World Humanitarian Day just a few days ago, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs highlighted a grim reality. 2023 was the deadliest year on the record for humanitarian workers. For our reflection today, the majority of the casualties occurred in the first 3 months of 2023 during the hostilities in Gaza, primarily due to airstrikes. Every day we have reports about the tragedy that is plaguing Gaza, and they are deeply terrifying. The relentless and horrifying Israel settlers' violence forcing out Palestinians from the occupied West Bank, coupled with the ongoing bombardment in the war-ravaged Gaza Strip, underscores the urgency of our meaningful intervention. The violent appropriation of land and destruction of property for settlements violate the international law and breach other rules of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the international peace and security are built based on a fruitful, constructive, and meaningful dialogue, as well as trust. Therefore, the parties to the conflict in Gaza should demonstrate their interest and willingness to change the course of events in Palestine through their actions. NGOs and the World Health Organization have warned us on the risk of a polio outbreak in Gaza, where the health situation is already chaotic. Amidst these gloomy circumstances, we echo the call for an urgent and immediate humanitarian and health assistance in Gaza, while the conditions for negotiations between the parties are underway. Mr. President, within the scope of its functions and powers, with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, this Council approved concrete measures to the conflict in the Gaza Strip by adopting the resolutions 2712, 2720, 272080, and 2730. It is our collective responsibility to ensure their full implementation. The parties to the conflict must comply with the resolutions and act in strict compliance with the Charter of the United Nations. We reiterate our full support for dialogue and negotiation efforts, mindful of the fact that the goal remains peace and prosperity for Gaza, the region, and beyond. We also reiterate our firm support for a just and comprehensive resolution between Israelis and Palestinians, with the State of Israel and the democratic sovereign state of Palestine, both as full members of the United Nations, living side by side in peace and security, and mutual recognition as full members of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Winnisland and Ms. Baxter for their briefings. Gaza has been subjected to more than 10 months of blockade, siege, bombing, and attacks that have killed more than 40,000 people and displaced 1.9 million. 80% of homes in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed, and 85% of the area is under emergency evacuation orders imposed by the Israeli military. In the West Bank, nearly 600 Palestinians have been killed since last October. Such a tragedy cannot go on any longer. The international community has repeatedly issued clarion calls for a ceasefire and an end to the fighting, and the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the International Court of Justice have all made clear demands. But what we have seen is that Israel has turned a deaf ear to them and has not shown any sign of a ceasefire. More than 2 months after the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2735, the Israeli military operations in Gaza continue, causing new casualties every day. At the same time, the repeated provocative and adventurous actions by the Israeli side have intensified the risk of conflict spillovers. The Middle East is hanging by a thread. It must be noted that the blind faith in achieving a total victory in Gaza through military means will only result in more innocent civilian casualties and will not create the conditions for the release of hostages, nor will it bring peace or tranquility to Israel and the region. Ceasefire negotiations and a political solution are the fundamental way out. It must be noted that humanitarian issues cannot be politicized, hunger cannot be weaponized, and civilian lives cannot be trivialized as bargaining chips. Israel must fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian law by opening all border crossings, guaranteeing rapid and safe access for humanitarian supplies at scale, ceasing restrictions and attacks on the United Nations and the humanitarian agencies, and providing support and cooperation for the polio vaccination program in Gaza. It is important to note that sustainable security can only be achieved by upholding the concept of common security. Regional peace must be built with the responsible participation of all parties. Achieving an independent Palestinian state and the implementation of a two-state solution is the only viable way forward for political settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli question. China urges Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza, to immediately stop its actions that stoke escalation of the situation in the region, and to end immediately placing obstacles to a ceasefire in Gaza. We urge countries with significant influence to demonstrate a sincere, impartial, and responsible attitude in pushing Israel to cease its military operations in Gaza as soon as possible and to stop the killing of civilians. China supports the Security Council in taking further necessary actions to promote the implementation of the relevant resolutions and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. China stands ready to work with the international community to make unremitting efforts to end the war in Gaza at an early date, alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe, implement a two-state solution, and achieve lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Coordinator Wennesland and Dr. Baxter for the important updates provided. Mr. President, I am almost certain that many around this table are burdened by the fact that the Council remains so impotent in the face of such colossal suffering by the Palestinian people over these last 10 months and indeed these past 7 decades. Although we have adopted 4 resolutions since 7th October, none has had the desired impact because we have not taken any decisions to enforce them, even as the mass atrocities being carried out by the Israeli government multiply. Consequently, more than 40,000 lives have been lost, and this number climbs every day. Simultaneously, a wider regional conflagration seems imminent, and the situation for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is deteriorating owing to a mix of settler violence and Israeli policies and actions that enable the violence. Last Thursday's attack on the Palestinian town of Jit in the West Bank was so unprecedented that it elicited rare condemnation from the Israeli government. One Israeli minister did say, however, that such incidents happen because Israeli soldiers are not allowed to, and I quote, shoot terrorists who throw stones, end of quote. The minister's assertion is illustrative of the heavy-handedness of Israel when it comes to Palestinians. Every form of resistance owing to the occupation and oppression is met with a brutality that would make some of history's most cruel oppressors blush. Guyana condemns the actions of Israeli citizens in Jit and calls on the Israeli government to ensure that its investigations lead to justice for every Palestinian affected by the incident. This leads me to contemplate, Mr. President, the illogical philosophy that has driven Israel's behavior towards Palestine over the last 7 decades. Israel has established that security guarantees are one of its highest priorities. Yet, it uses its military might to make enemies in the region, thereby undermining its own security. This has now led to heightened mistrust and tensions in the region, with civilians losing the most. This cycle must be halted because peace in the Middle East is not elusive. Guyana calls on all concerned to lay down their weapons and seek the path of peace. Mr. President, the exasperation of the Palestinian people is palpable, having suffered indignity after indignity over the last 10 months. They have reportedly been used as human shields as Israel scopes out buildings in search of Hamas operatives. Part of the reasoning reportedly offered, too many dogs had died from the dog units
that searched for explosives. Is Palestinian life worth nothing? The lives of both Palestinians and Israelis are sacred, and none is superior to the other. None is more worthy of protection than the other. It is ironic that the very thing that Israel wants for itself and its people, it denies the Palestinians: peace and security. Peace and security for Palestine is rooted in their freedom from the occupying power and the achievement of their independence. The International Court of Justice has already determined that the Israeli occupation of Palestine is unlawful and puts the two-state solution at risk. Successive resolutions of the General Assembly have affirmed the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. What is missing, Mr. President, is Israel's compliance with its legal obligations. This Council must seriously consider effective measures to secure compliance. Mr. President, Guyana calls for an end to the ongoing hostilities as one of the first and most important steps towards addressing the myriad challenges that have developed in Gaza since 7th October. Dr. Baxter and Mr. Wennesland have reminded us about the polio cases that have been confirmed in Gaza, a disease that was eradicated from the Strip 25 years ago. We call on Israel to allow the WHO to administer the 1.6 million vaccines ready to be deployed. Skin diseases and hepatitis are also a growing challenge amidst a woefully inadequate healthcare system. Combined with food insecurity, constant displacement, and general destruction across the Strip, the situation is one of utter desperation and devastation. In this context, the UN, as well as other humanitarian agencies, must be allowed to do their work on behalf of civilians in Gaza. The attacks on UN premises and staff must cease, and unimpeded access must be granted to the Strip. Guyana calls on the Israeli authorities to fulfill their obligations in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Guyana continues to stress the urgency of reaching an agreement for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a surge in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilians. These are the immediate steps needed to address the most pressing needs, and we look forward to a deal being reached in the coming days. In the long term, however, questions of governance, reconstruction, contiguity of Gaza and the occupied West Bank, learning loss, and trauma are all to be grappled with, taking full account of the will of the Palestinian people. The biggest question, however, is that of justice. The Palestinians must be redressed, not only for the things they were made to endure in this war, but also over the last 7 decades, beginning with their expulsion from most of their homeland in 1948. I conclude, Mr. President, by referencing the words of my Caribbean brother, Robert Nesta Marley, better known as Bob Marley, who said that, and I quote, "Until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war," end of quote. This Council must make it consequential for any member state to promulgate such a dangerous philosophy. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and Dr. Baxter for their briefings. It has been over 10 months since the dreadful terror attack against Israel on 7th October, and in the wake of countless civilians killed in Gaza, the open wound that is this conflict only continues to fester. These hostilities must stop. An immediate and permanent ceasefire must be agreed as soon as possible. It is critical in the face of man-made famine conditions and the threat of poliovirus and other diseases. We fully support the Secretary-General's call for a polio pause to tackle this crisis. We stress, however, that the United Nations cannot work to save lives through vaccines only to have them destroyed again by bombs and bullets. We support ongoing efforts by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar towards a framework agreement consistent with the Council Resolution 2735. Malta strongly urges both parties to agree to the terms and implement the ceasefire to ensure the hostages are released and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is addressed. This is imperative as the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza deteriorates daily. When speaking of the living nightmare that Gazan civilians experience day after day, it is truly disturbing that all major threats to the human condition can be used as descriptors: famine, disease, displacement, lawlessness, impunity, psychological trauma, and hopelessness. Women and children are among the most exposed to danger in this conflict. The deliberate denial of health care and dissemination of infrastructure severely impacts pregnant women and newborn babies. Over 16,000 children have been killed so far. We cannot even begin to comprehend the long-term effects this conflict will have on surviving parents, children, and the future generations of Gaza. Strict adherence to international humanitarian law is urgently needed. This has been severely lacking, despite it being an obligation of the conflict parties. Member states also have the responsibility to strive to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law. Malta urges the unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance across Gaza, including through the opening of all crossings, including border crossings. We also call for effective protection and proper operational facilitation for United Nations and humanitarian personnel to ensure they can safely access the population. This also includes support to UNRWA, which is a necessary actor for any humanitarian response in Gaza. We have consistently asked this at every meeting for the past 10 months. The full, immediate, and effective implementation of all relevant Council resolutions and the orders of the International Court of Justice remain an imperative. Moreover, we are deeply concerned that occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, has also become plagued by numerous human rights violations. The latest of these include the appalling alleged sexual torture of Palestinian detainees in Israeli administrative detention facilities. Thousands of Palestinians, including women and children, are being arbitrarily detained in these facilities. They must be released. We stress that independent international investigations into these circumstances need to urgently take place. President, in its advisory opinion delivered on 19 July 2024, the ICJ concluded that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful. It further concluded that Israel has an obligation to bring this occupation to an end, cease all new settlement activities, and evacuate all existing settlers. As such, Israel's recently announced plans for a new illegal settlement in the occupied West Bank is unacceptable. Such decisions contravene international law and must be retracted. We also condemn last week's violent settler rampage in the Palestinian village of Jit, which resulted in the killing of one man, as well as inflammatory visits which violate the historic status quo of Jerusalem's holy sites. The West Bank is already on the precipice, and these actions only breed further instability. We also condemn the most recent terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. Malta urges all regional parties to prioritize diplomacy, reduce tensions, and avoid any actions that could escalate the situation further, jeopardizing any possibility of a ceasefire agreement. In this context, and in fear of an imminent regional escalation, we continue to reiterate our appeal for swift easing in tensions. To conclude, it is through this path that we can hope to return to a political horizon, which is the only way to make credible progress towards the comprehensive realization of the internationally agreed two-state solution, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides. Malta remains steadfastly committed to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Coordinator Winsland and Dr. Baxter for their informative and sobering briefings. More than 10 months into the conflict, which was triggered by Hamas' attack on Israel in October last year, every passing day brings more and more destruction, casualties, suffering, and trauma, despite the international efforts. The hostages and their loved ones have been living in an unendurable state of fear and uncertainty that increases day by day. The hostages must be freed and returned to their family. Japan is appalled by the relentless hostilities in Gaza, leading to an unimaginable toll of civilian deaths and injuries, most of them women and children. We remain gravely concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian situation. Palestinians face endless evacuation orders by the Israel Defense Forces, on top of suffering from hunger and lack of access to water, medicine, and shelter. Gaza's children have lost 1 year of education. Humanitarian aid workers must be protected in accordance with the international humanitarian law. The repeated attacks against them that we have seen are totally unacceptable. The spread of disease, in particular the risk of polio, is deeply alarming. Japan welcomes the announcement of the WHO and UNICEF of their plan to launch 2 rounds of polio vaccinations starting at the end of this month. We expect Israel to ensure a safe and effective delivery of the necessary doses and encourage collaborative efforts by COGAT in this regard. Mr. President, tensions are boiling beyond Gaza. Japan reiterates its deep concern and regret over the continued illegal settlement expansion by Israel in the West Bank, as well as the intensifying settler violence. In this vein, Japan has recently introduced sanctions against the violent settlers. Their conduct undermines the viability of a two-state solution and cannot be condoned. We also express grave concern over the dangerous escalation caused by Hezbollah, the Houthi, and other military groups. All sides must step back from the brink, avoid bellicose rhetoric, and de-escalate the situation. Japan is actively engaging regional stakeholders such as Iran and Lebanon through various channels, including direct outreach by our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, to avoid any further deterioration. Mr. President, a ceasefire in Gaza is essential to bring an end to this nightmare and restore much-needed peace and stability in the Middle East. The latest round of negotiations is critical, and we highly appreciate the tireless diplomatic efforts led by the US, Egypt, and Qatar. Now is the time to achieve a long-awaited ceasefire, bring hostages back, and expand aid delivery across Gaza at scale. We therefore urgently appeal to the parties, especially Hamas, to show the will to finally conclude the deal in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2735. The violence must stop immediately. Mr. President, even at the time of devastation, we must not lose sight of the future. Japan reiterates its unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution where Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace with secure and recognized borders consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions. In this regard, we stress the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and we will spare no effort to revitalize the PA toward that end. Only in this way can this decades-long tragic dispute finally be resolved. I thank you.
The representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Dr. Louisa Baxter of Save the Children for their briefings. In view of the humanitarian disaster caused by the conflict in the Middle East, including the ever-worsening situation in the Gaza Strip, Switzerland has consistently called for the implementation of the resolutions adopted by this Council since October 7th, 2023. It is imperative that a ceasefire agreement be reached as soon as possible. To this end, we welcome the mediation efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and we call on the parties to engage in these negotiations in good faith. Regardless of the outcome of these negotiations, Switzerland recalls that the obligations of international law must be respected by all parties. The protection of civilians must be guaranteed, hostages released, and humanitarian access authorized and facilitated immediately and unconditionally. Since the adoption of Resolution 2712 last November, this Council has called on the parties to comply strictly with their obligations under international law and to refrain from depriving the civilian population of essential services and humanitarian assistance essential to their survival. Such deprivation has a disproportionate effect on children. According to UNICEF, almost a third of civilians in Gaza are under the age of 10. 640,000 of them are the most acutely vulnerable in the event of a polio outbreak, and that is against a backdrop in which the health system is already devastated. Mr. President, the UN and its partners have for months been advocating for safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access and are ready to act to prevent and contain polio. Switzerland supports the urgent implementation of the UN's two-phase vaccination plan, and we are ready to contribute to that effort financially. We commend the speed and efficiency with which the resources necessary for the implementation of this plan have been mobilized. We reiterate that humanitarian and medical personnel must be protected in order to enable them to do their job and to save lives. The Council reiterates its commitments in this regard in its press elements adopted on Monday. Moreover, hostages and all persons detained by the parties linked to the conflict must be treated humanely in all circumstances, and they must receive ICRC visits and the medical assistance they require. Switzerland is gravely concerned by the recent OHCHR report on the hostages in Gaza and the Palestinian detainees, including children. That report points to possible serious human rights violations and abuses, as well as possible war crimes committed by all parties. Mr. President, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, inflammatory rhetoric, provocations, unilateral measures, and acts of violence against civilians are fueling tensions. Despite the unanimous appeals of this Council, attacks, threats, and intimidation by Israeli settlers against the Palestinian population, as recently seen in the village of Jit, continue with almost total impunity. Switzerland condemns these attacks. Israel has the obligation to protect Palestinian civilians, to prevent violence against them, including by settlers, and to ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice. Actions such as the latest visit by Israel's Minister of National Security to the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount continue to contribute to rising tensions, and this is also on a regional scale. The historic status quo over the holy places in Jerusalem and Jordan's custodial role in this respect must be strictly respected. It is important that the Council remain united in its call for de-escalation. To this end, a ceasefire in Gaza could make a major contribution, including along the Blue Line. We must also support any effort able to achieve a two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace within safe and recognized borders. May a ceasefire agreement in Gaza without delay pave the way towards such a solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join in thanking Special Coordinator Wennesland and Dr. Baxter for their briefings. For more than 10 months, we have witnessed heartbreaking stories of Palestinian civilians and Israeli hostages. To put an end to these ongoing tragedies, an immediate ceasefire is urgently needed. Any further extension of this conflict will lead to more killings of innocent civilians. Another irrefutable reason for a ceasefire is the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, including shortages of food, water, and fuel, the destruction of the health system, and Israel's repeated evacuation orders. With the never-ending threat to the safety of aid workers, alongside the complete destruction of law and order, it is clear that without an immediate ceasefire, it will be impossible to dramatically ease the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. We are particularly concerned by a possible outbreak of a widespread polio pandemic, as Dr. Baxter briefed the situation on the ground with a sense of urgency. Parties to the conflict should heed the voices of humanitarian actors, including UNICEF and the WHO, calling for a ceasefire, or at the very least, a humanitarian pause to carry out a full-scale vaccination campaign. The current medical capacity in Gaza cannot sustain an epidemic. And we must recall that viruses do not respect borders. Polio in Gaza is a regional threat. Ever more dangerous regional tension is another impetus for an immediate ceasefire. Exacerbating violence in the West Bank, daily strikes by Hezbollah and the IDF across and far beyond the blue line, and ongoing attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea. All of these exemplify the urgent need again for de-escalation in the region. We understand that the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, which should be condemned by all council members, was a traumatic experience for all Israeli citizens. Of course, Israel has a right to protect its citizens and its security under international law. But this does not negate Israel's obligation under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. So-called precise attacks, those that still kill numerous innocent civilians, are simply not enough to fulfill Israel's legal obligations. We must keep in mind that without a durable resolution based on the two-state solution, Israel's long-term security cannot be guaranteed. An immediate ceasefire must be the first step toward this aspiration. Everyone, including Israeli decision-makers and the Hamas leaders, need to prioritize the enormous suffering of Israeli hostages and Palestinian civilians and regional peace. It is time for a deal that has been delayed for too long. We appreciate in this regard the ongoing efforts by the US, Egypt, and Qatar for mediation. Based on a durable ceasefire, Israel and Palestine, represented by reformed and strengthened Palestinian Authority, should work together to chart a new path towards coexistence, security, and dignity for all. Any acts that hinder the realization of the two-state solution should be firmly rejected. It is deeply troublesome that settlement expansion, violence, and impunity in the West Bank have worsened, particularly since October 7th. We condemn violence by Israeli settlers, including last Thursday's deadly rampage in the village of Jit. We appeal to Israel to respect the human rights of Palestinians and implement measures to prevent crimes committed by settlers. Inflammatory rhetoric and acts by far-right ministers, including visits to holy sites, must be rejected. Any terrorism, such as last Sunday's explosion in Tel Aviv, claimed by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, must also be resolutely condemned and rejected. All regional actors must focus on the only question: how to de-escalate the grave situation in the Middle East. Cycles of vengeance will help no one. Rather, this only lead to more death, suffering, and agony for innocent civilians. Regional stakeholders, in particular neighboring countries, should play responsible roles, rather than pledging revenge, as any counterattack will only perpetuate further violence. Both sides across the blue line must also exert maximum restraint. Any acts in violation of Resolution 1701, including the provision of military assistance to non-state actors in Lebanon, as well as airspace violations, should not be committed. Other non-state actors in the region, including the Houthis, must also halt all unjustifiable acts that further undermine regional stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. I want to extend my appreciation to Mr. Thor Wensland and especially to Dr. Louisa Baxter from Save the Children for their critical insight. To Dr. Baxter, I want to say that we admire your dedication and courage. Your work shows the real face of humanity, that humanity that should guide all of us and guide our debate and action. As highlighted by the briefer, the situation in Gaza is dire, with no progress nearly 11 months after the Israeli occupying power launched their brutal operation of punishment against defenseless Palestinian civilians. We are still counting the death. Over 40,000. And we are still counting the injured, over 90,000. And these figures may rise rapidly, not only due to the deteriorating situation in the region, but also to the imminent risk of diseases outbreaks, with a collapsed health system in Gaza due to the Israeli forces' deliberate targeting of hospitals and medical personnel. In this context, the spread of polio is a looming threat. Today, 20 out of 36 hospitals in Gaza are out of service, making an effective response to this threat almost impossible. Despite these challenges, the international humanitarian community stands ready to help with the full-fledged vaccination campaign. However, we cannot envision any vaccination campaign under continuous Israeli bombardment. We are all aware that the so-called deconfliction mechanism is simply a fiction in Gaza. We need a real cessation of hostilities to ensure the success of this campaign. And we echo WHO and UNICEF calls for a humanitarian pause to allow for a thorough campaign of vaccination. Mr. President, today, the barbaric Israeli occupation continues in total impunity. It continues its policy of killing Palestinians and making Gaza a nightmare, making Gaza an unlivable place for Palestinians. And the situation is catastrophic, and it worsens on a daily basis, and there is no sign of hope. For months, we have been told that we are close to securing a deal, putting an end to the massacre of the Palestinian civilians. Unfortunately, nothing happened. And while we continue our support to the effort of the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, to reach a deal, but rapidly. Unfortunately, the reality is clear for everyone. The Israeli occupying power continue to ignore international calls, including Security Council decision, including ICG order. And while the Middle East is facing the risk of a broader conflict, we firmly believe that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza is the only path to avoiding further escalation in the region. Algeria demands the immediate and effective implementation of Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2735. This resolution is clear. It guarantees a permanent end of hostilities. It guarantees a full withdrawal of Israeli occupying forces from Gaza. And it guarantees the liberation and the return of all prisoners to their homes. This resolution must be implemented now. Mr. President, the occupying Israeli authorities are determined to crush any hope for an independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. They deny the establishment of Palestinian state. They annex Palestinian lands. They expand settlement. And frequently, they storm Al-Aqsa Mosque. They unleash settlers terrorists in the West Bank, while they loot and kill Palestinians in total impunity. I want to warn that the risk of Gaza's tragedy may duplicate in the West Bank. The international community cannot remain silent. And to conclude, Mr. President, it's time to end the carnage in Gaza. It's time to close this dark chapter in the history of the Middle East. Dark chapter also of the history of the international community. and of the Security Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Mr. Tur Venesland. We thank him for the comprehensive overview of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We are also grateful to Dr. Louisa Baxter for an emotional and a sobering description of the situation in the Strip. It is painful, but we have to acknowledge that the Security Council, as the main UN body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, for more than 10 months now has basically remained a passive observer of the continued bloodbath in Gaza, which took by now more than 40,000 innocent civilian lives. As was stated by the UN Secretary-General Guterres, the level of killings and destruction in the course of the Israeli operations is the highest one compared to any other conflict anywhere in the world during his mandate. And what is happening in Gaza is, and I quote, utter lawlessness. We are deeply disappointed by the fact that the Council has not been able to demand an unequivocal ceasefire and ensure that there is compliance with this demand by all parties to the conflict. 2.5 months ago, Security Council members adopted Resolution 2735, drafted by Washington. And at the time, our American colleagues told us that the fate of the deal between Hamas and Israel on ceasefire and hostages release hinged upon that resolution. And the time has now come to take stock of how the document impacted the situation on the ground. And we can answer the question unequivocally. It didn't impact the situation on the ground at all. Israel and their agreement with the so-called President Biden plan providing for an immediate ceasefire, their agreement is something that our American colleagues at the time told us about. But Israel is continuing its brutal operation, only pausing when they need to. Over 2.5 months, almost 3,000 Palestinians fell victim to it. And of course, the full withdrawal of the Israeli army from Gaza and efforts to restore the destroyed infrastructure is not something that anyone is even considering. At the same time, Israel is essentially blocking the humanitarian workers' work, creating all kinds of obstacles to them. And similarly, other resolutions passed by the Council, humanitarian resolutions that we have passed since the current escalation of the conflict, remain words on paper. We continue thinking it's unacceptable that members of the Security Council in June signed off on obviously false statement in the American resolution where it said that Israel supposedly had already agreed to the proposed deal. Even the official statements by Israel at the very same meeting clearly show that the leadership of West Jerusalem had no intention of stopping their military operation in Gaza. The delegation of the Russian Federation at the time abstained on voting on the American draft, and we do not regret that abstention one bit. It is noteworthy that having forgotten what they stated in June, our American colleagues are trying to sell us yet another new quantity, having modified the parameters of the original deal in a way that is suited for Israel. And today, the representative of the United States in this room, not even having tried to explain what these modifications are, it was once again calling upon members of the Security Council to exert pressure on Hamas. According to the information we have, Israel is now insisting on keeping the IDF military presence in Gaza, including their control over the crossing with Egypt and the Philadelphia corridor. We do note that such a changes to the parameters of the deal is also something that some countries in the region vehemently object to. And I would like to put a question to our American colleagues. On whose behalf are you acting now when you're trying to push through that deal, which is principally different from the original one? The Security Council never blessed the deal formulated in this way. And why, when you call upon all of us to exert pressure exclusively on Hamas leadership to make sure that the movement accepts the new Israeli whim, you consistently refuse to work with Western Jerusalem, which critically depends on you for weapons supplies? Is this something that well-intentioned and impartial mediators do? Time has shown that all the doubts that we had about the true reason behind that American product were confirmed. And yet another resolution by the Security Council, which was pushed through by Washington, became not just a diplomatic cover for Israel to continue with their systematic cleanser of Gaza, but it also became a spoiler. Because of this, the Security Council no longer undertakes efforts to have a document which would be in line with the strict and unequivocal demands to parties to cease fire. Moreover, because of the provocative acts by Israel over the past 2 months, the Middle East region has come even closer to the brink of a global conflict, and the Security Council, through the United States' efforts, is not doing anything to stop the bloodbath that Israel is continuing in Gaza. A week ago, members of the Security Council were discussing the tragedy in the Tabein school. There, as a result of an Israeli strike, more than 100 people died and dozens were wounded. As we warned at the time, this incident was not an unfortunate episode. It was rather a manifestation of a conscious policy by the Israeli leadership. On the 20th of August, the Israeli Air Force attacked a school in the Mustafa Hafez region in Gaza City. At least 12 people died as a result. The Prime Minister Netanyahu, in reaction to the joint appeals by the international community to stop the killing of peaceful Palestinians, states that he will not stop until Hamas is fully destroyed. And if it weren't for his American allies, he would not display such a disregard for the position of the overwhelming opinion of the UN member states. Separate point I would like to make, and it's a point that is unacceptable to have the provocative acts by the leadership of Israel at the OPT, and I refer specifically to the 13th of August visit by the Minister of National Security Ben-Gvir to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The Israeli authorities should undertake effective measures to stop this fallacious practice, which is a blatant violation of the status quo of the old city holy sites. Colleagues, how much longer are we going to remain idle when American would-be negotiators continue putting on a show and feed us empty promises of speedy results of their diplomatic efforts on the ground? The reality is that Washington, for 10 months now, has basically kept the entire council hostage, threatening their veto and not allowing us to pass a strict and unequivocal decisions neither on the Palestinian issue, nor on the ceasefire in Gaza, nor on the moving of the Middle East peace process forward. And this is all the more lamentable because it is the maniacal desire of the United States to monopolize the Middle East peace process and to reformat it according to Israeli patterns that led to the dramatic consequences that we're witnessing today. I don't think I need to say to you that this situation undermines the authority of the Security Council. The Security Council, since October, has not been able to pass any effective decisions which are needed not only for the just settlement of the Palestinian issue, in line with our very own resolutions, but also to prevent the regional war in the Middle East. And if Resolution 2735 is not being implemented, well, let's pass a new document which would send an unequivocal signal to the spoilers that what they're doing will not be allowed to happen with impunity, and provide such a resolution with a toolbox which could help end violence regardless of the whims displayed by any of the sides to the conflict. It's of critical importance also to make sure that Washington stops finally their multi-billion military assistance to Israel, which is being used to destroy peaceful Palestinians. How many more victims are needed for the Security Council to finally act in line with its mandate instead of blindly following the U.S. and Israeli lead? 40,000 Palestinians, most of them women and children. Is that not enough for us to pass the decisions that are needed? And we are formulating it this way to make sure that all of our colleagues feel their historic responsibility on our shoulders, and we are ready to work with all of those who share this position of ours. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Sierra Leone. I thank Special Coordinator Tom Wennesland for his briefing, and I also thank Dr. Louisa Baxter for the valuable and deeply concerning information provided. The conflict in the Gaza Strip has gone on for too long for the Palestinian civilians, the hostages, and the Israeli civilians, causing immense human suffering and devastation. It is also a deeply worrying state for civilians in Lebanon, the occupied Golan Heights, and wider Middle East region. Amidst the sustained escalation of violence and the dire humanitarian crisis since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2735, there is a collective desperation for meaningful progress to be made towards the cessation of hostilities and to reinvigorate the process to achieve lasting peace. There is no luxury of time to save current and future generations for the long-term consequences of the Gaza conflict, including physical and mental. This Council, the UN system, and the international community have acted on the objectives of achieving a ceasefire, securing the release of hostages, prisoners, facilitating safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance to civilians in the Gaza Strip. During this month of August, we have observed the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions and World Humanitarian Day, respectively. We reflect on the death toll of over 40,000 civilians, 289 humanitarian aid workers, 92,743 injured persons in the Gaza Strip since the 7th October 2023. This adds to the 1,200 killed during the 7 October attacks. We continue to insist that we cannot normalize the unjustifiable and unacceptable toll and scale of the conflict. It is incumbent upon us to put a human face to those killed, with a report of entire Palestinian families killed by Israeli strikes in Gaza. This brings to light the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. We therefore recall the statement of the International Committee of the Red Cross, noting that, and I quote, "The 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law, reminds us of the world's agreement that wars must have limits, and that regardless of the circumstances, respect for human dignity and compassion must always guide our actions." End of quote. On this note, Sierra Leone pays tribute to all humanitarian personnel, including UNRWA and all other partners working under the most challenging circumstances to provide aid to the vulnerable population in the Gaza Strip. And certainly we pay tribute to Dr. Baxter and her colleagues. We recognize their tireless efforts in preserving human dignity and saving lives. Colleagues, with the worsening humanitarian situation and a collapsed health system, the fear of the spread of the polio virus is a stark reality, with the confirmation of the first active case of poliomyelitis in the Gaza Strip by the Ministry of Health of Palestine. The situation is alarming, and the words of the UN Secretary General, and I quote, "Hundreds of thousands of children in the Gaza Strip are at risk, and the UN is poised to launch a vital polio vaccine campaign for them, for the more than 640,000 children under the age of 10, end of quote. Sierra Leone supports the polio vaccine campaign by the UN. To mitigate the evident risk, we echo the call of the UN Secretary General and other humanitarian partners for parties to the conflict to facilitate humanitarian access that will ensure an effective vaccination campaign for the vulnerable children in the Gaza Strip and beyond. Colleagues, Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the surge in violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem triggered by settlement expansion, land dispute, provocation, incitement, extensive infrastructural damage, search and arrest operations, and detention of Palestinians. We condemn the violent act, the incitement of such act, and the blatant impunity. We also condemn all attacks directed against civilians, including the attack in Tel Aviv. For 10 months, our assessment of the conflict on civilians, in particular women and children, underscores the urgent need for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We've heard from Special Coordinator Tom Wannesland, ceasefire now. Our call for a ceasefire is embedded in the fundamental principles of humanity, and it is a call to end impunity and violence, protect civilians, support humanitarian workers and assistants, and uphold human rights. Since this Council's last meeting on the region on 13th August 2024 to date, there have been reports of deadly incidents in residential buildings around Gaza, Gaza City, Al-Mawasi, and West Khan Yunis, amongst others, that have claimed about 134 lives, with 342 injuries. These lives could have been saved if only parties to the conflict were attentive to our initial and persistent calls. We acknowledge the efforts of the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, and welcome the resumption of negotiations in Doha last week. We encourage the mediators to employ all possible tools to ensure the talks lead to an agreement speedily. We emphasize the obligations on the parties to implement Security Council resolutions, including 2735. We further urge for steps to be taken to ensure Palestinian rights to self-determination is fully respected and implemented. The advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of 19th July 2024 is clear on the unlawful nature of the occupation by Israel. Accordingly, the political horizon of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security remains the only legally acceptable outcome. So let me close by reiterating a call for full respect for international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, as well as accountability for the reported atrocities committed both in Israel and Gaza. I thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank the briefers and in particular Dr. Louisa Baxter for her poignant testimony, and I want, through her, to pay a tribute to all humanitarians working in impossible conditions, notably Palestinian humanitarian workers. Instead of being offered the protection they are entitled to as they carry out their life-saving work, they are being targeted to prevent them from helping the Palestinian civilian population. This genocide has not spared them, and yet they remain true to their sacred mission and deserve our gratitude and support, and we salute them. Mr. President, Gaza had been polio-free for the last 25 years. Now, it is under the imminent threat of the spread of this terrible disease that can cause paralysis and death. Gaza does not need more paralysis and death. First by bombs and bullets, now combined with occupation-sponsored famine and disease. Gaza has witnessed life destroyed. It needs life to be restored, and it needs it right now. We fully support the proposal of the Secretary General for an urgent vaccination campaign to stop the spread of this disease. Any obstruction of this effort will serve as further proof of Israel's genocidal intent and actions against our people. The Secretary General said the end of this month, along with humanitarian organizations in the medical field, to begin this campaign. Are we going to be supporting him in implementing the vaccination campaign and the ceasefire that he is calling for? 2 periods, each for 7 days, to allow for the inoculation of 640,000 plus Palestinian children under the age of 10, to save them from pluming genocide? Or are we going just to praise him for what he is doing and remain sitting on our seats? Are we going to march with him and with the teams, medical teams, in order to implement this call to save the lives of more than 640,000 children in Gaza? The minimum, while you are still debating and the mediators still trying to reach an agreement on the ceasefire, are we going to allow this specific, limited call for inoculation to take place? Are we going to be marching with the SG and the teams to do that a reality? I know there is not a single person with an ounce of humanity in him or her that would stand against such a call. Are we going to let one country to have the veto on everything, including whether to inoculate 640,000 Palestinian children, to have the inoculation, the 2 doses, in sequence, maybe 1 week or 2 weeks apart, to take place, or to be stopped by those who are still continuing and waging the genocide against our people? I told you last time I spoke, when are you going to act? This is even smaller task. Are you going to act to implement that smaller humanitarian task to save the lives of children? Or are you going to fail the test again? We also share the Secretary General's assessment that the, and I quote, ultimate vaccine for polio is peace and an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, end of quotation. The international community and this council have long ago demanded a ceasefire, and yet the horrors continue. Mr. President, the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip have witnessed and felt in their flesh the planned collapse of all the requirements of life in Gaza, the collapse of the health system under Israel's assault, the collapse of the education system through the destruction of schools and universities, the collapse of any remaining sense of security by the destruction of virtually all homes and the bombardments of shelters and tents and every so-called safe zone, the collapse of the social structures by displacements and death, and Israel still has not had enough. Still, it carries on, threatening and inflicting more death and devastation. This Israeli government does not care about even its own citizens, killing hostages and bragging about retrieving their corpses when it could have secured their release alive. But clearly, it cares more about killing Palestinians than it cares about saving Israelis. So those who want to place the fate of our people in the hands of this Israeli government, hoping it will ever act in good faith, are gravely mistaken. This is tragically proven every day. There must be a ceasefire now, in line with the terms of Resolution 2735, and with no further conditions and bad faith demands that go against the spirit and the letter of the resolution and that clearly aim at derailing the efforts for a ceasefire. For more than 2.5 months, who stopped you from implementing Resolution 2735, which starts with a ceasefire, which guarantees the release of the hostages and the prisoners, which calls for humanitarian assistance to scale to the needs of our people, and using the words of President Biden, minimum of 600 truckloads of humanitarian assistance to enter the Gaza Strip on a daily basis. Who is stopping you from implementing this resolution? Who is stopping you from acting and saying, on date so-and-so, at hour so-and-so, a ceasefire will take place, and we will see who will allow it to happen and those who will not allow it to happen, and therefore to make them to pay the consequences of their rejection of the will of the Security Council through its resolution. Are you ready to say next Monday at 12 noon, Jerusalem time, a ceasefire will take place? Are you willing to act? Are you willing to do something on the basis of what you approved? Or you want to continue giving excuses for the Israeli occupying authorities to continue killing the Palestinian people? When are you going to act? You have the tools to act. You have the resolutions to act. Please act. Deal or no deal, there is no excuse for the Israelis' continued killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, of kids, of babies. There is no excuse for the abandonment felt by Palestinian mothers and fathers, by Palestinian children, by Palestinian youth, by each and every Palestinian in Gaza who has survived so far this epic nightmare, who have been fighting every day for the survival of their loved ones, who have not had a chance to mourn or heal or rest or bury their loved ones. There is no excuse for permitting the continued assaults by Israeli occupying forces and settler militias on Palestinian civilians in the West Bank, as many of you have indicated, including East Jerusalem, for the targeting of children executed by Israeli snipers terrorized by settlers. As we sit here speaking, week after week, month after month, they are struggling to survive the occupation's open attempts at their ethnic cleansing and annihilation, still trying to preserve the last remaining shreds of life in the hope that the world will show up, that humanity will prevail, and that the international community to act. They have no reason to hope, but they are refusing to surrender to death or to their occupiers and killers. They do not only deserve your respect and admiration. They are entitled to your support and protection. How much longer are we going to fail them? How many more horrors will our children have to suffer? How long will this occupation and all its horrors continue? Are we going to continue dealing with the Palestinian people and the Palestinian children on a different scale than others? Or are we going to use the same stick of measurement of humanitarian principles that should apply to all, including the Palestinian people? When confronted with a genocide, the responsibility of the world is to stop it. When there is genocide, it is your duty to stop it and stop it immediately and unconditionally. This is a war of atrocities, and the only way to stop it, to stop these atrocities, is to stop this war and to stop it immediately and now. It cannot be justified in any way. It cannot be justified in any way. It must be stopped, and it must be stopped now. Mr. President, we often say justice is blind, and that expression is universally understood as meaning justice does not discriminate. It is fair to all and equal for all, regardless of race, nationality, ethnicity, religion. But there are those who want justice to be blind to our people's pain and suffering, to be blind when the crimes are committed by Israelis. We will not accept that, nor should you. Palestinian victims are not less entitled to justice. The Palestinian people is not less entitled to freedom. And Israel does not have a right to genocide, a right to commit atrocities against them. I warn against any actions or statements that continue to equivocate or appease Israel as it commits such horrific crimes against us. Or even worse, that enable the commission of such crimes. Mr. President, while we are awaiting for your action, we are initiating actions from our side. President Abbas has declared his intention and the intention of the Palestinian leadership to head to Gaza. He has called for leaders from around the globe to join him and to support this initiative. I have communicated the position of the leadership to the Secretary General about this initiative, and to you, Mr. President, which I assume that you shared it with the colleagues, the members of the Security Council. Allow me to call on the Security Council to take part in a visit to the Gaza Strip to see firsthand the horrors our people are enduring, to support and to push to secure the ability of President Abbas to reach the Gaza Strip, to work with urgency to stop the genocide and stop the crimes being perpetrated against our people. If you are not going to decide a ceasefire, let us all together go to the Gaza Strip and try to impose the ceasefire by our presidents. As leaders of the globe, led by our president, by the Secretary General, by the President of the Security Council, by all those who have spines to come and say, we are coming to demand a ceasefire and to demand it now in the Gaza Strip and to show empathy, support, and solidarity with those who have been suffering immensely for more than 10.5 months. And also, we are going to initiate another action to put an end to this illegal occupation as soon as possible by legislating next month in the General Assembly the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice to an actionable resolution demanding within a time frame the end of this illegal occupation and all the other issues contained in that historic advisory opinion. And I expect almost all of you to be with us in trying really to put an end to this illegal occupation and to pave the way for implementing your global consensus on the two-state solution by ending this occupation and making the two-state reality a fact on the ground, not only as it is insinuated in the resolution and the advisory opinion of the ICJ, but also by the many resolutions that we have adopted in the Security Council and the General Assembly over years. We are sick and tired of waiting. The time for waiting is over. The time for action is now. The time for the implementation of the two-state solution will begin with a significant step in the month of September next month, and we invite all of you to be with us. Mr. President, Gaza has been at several points in our long journey to freedom the beating heart of Palestine. Jerusalem is the crown on top of our heads. Gaza is the beating heart of Palestine. It is today the bleeding heart of Palestine. Stop the bleeding. You are the Security Council. You are entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Stop the bleeding in Gaza. Impose an immediate ceasefire. Stop the suffering. Protect our children and all our civilians as international law and our collective humanity demand. End this genocide. End it now. Impose a ceasefire immediately now. And I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm quite familiar with the prestigious halls and corridors of this building. This is my second term as Israel's ambassador to the UN. During my first term, I worked towards promoting the integration of Israel into the international community. I experienced the significance of meaningful international cooperation, being elected Vice President of the General Assembly and Chairman of the Sixth Committee. At the same time, I was also exposed to the deep flaws which have infiltrated this organization, its double standards, obsession with Israel, and even blatant acts of anti-Semitism, which are not uncommon. However, I have returned to a different UN, different faces, different attitudes, a different environment, and truthfully, I'm representing a different Israel. An Israel forced to fight a war on 7 fronts against those who wish us dead, all connected to their masters, the Ayatollahs of Iran. Distinguished members, as I stand here today, my people are under attack. 10 months ago, a terrorist army invaded southern Israel. They murdered over 1,000 of our citizens and committed the most heinous atrocities: torture, rape, beheading, Hundreds of beautiful young Israelis celebrating life at a music festival, murdered. Hundreds of innocent human beings sleeping in their homes with their families, murdered. Hundreds more were taken hostage into captivity, more brutal than anything we can imagine. To this day, over 100,000 Israelis remain displaced in their own country, unable to return home due to constant rocket attacks from both Hamas and Hezbollah. Tamar Simantov was an artist, a mother, and a community leader. She was running to be mayor of the Eshkol region in the southern part of Israel. Her husband, Johnny, was an operations manager, loved by his family and their kibbutz near Oz. Together, they built a small, beautiful family. They had 3 children, Shachar, Arbel, and Omer. At 6:30 on October 7th, Tamar sent a message to all her friends at the kibbutz WhatsApp group, checking if everyone was safe after rocket sirens echoed through the kibbutz. This is part of the routine for the people who live on the southern border. Just 3 hours later, a final message came on WhatsApp. She had been wounded, and then silence. The last words from Johnny, her husband, to his sister were, "They're here, they're burning us, we are suffocating." In their final moments, Tamar and Johnny held onto each other, trying to shield their children from the evil which had invaded their homes. Wounded, they chose to suffer the smoke and fire together rather than let the terror outside claim them. The Simantov family, like so many others, was erased in a single day by an act of unspeakable evil. Their home, a place once filled with the laughter of children, is now silent. Any reasonable person would have expected this council to act immediately and unequivocally to condemn the terror, the bloodshed, the inhumanity, to support Israel in its mission to dismantle the terror organization responsible for these atrocities. To expect anything less would be lunacy. Yet, here we are, 320 days since the slaughter, and what have we heard? Silence. No condemnation of Hamas. No recognition of the atrocities committed. The UN Security Council was created and charged with protecting peace after the horrors of the Holocaust. How could it not condemn the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust? Yesterday, August 21st, was International Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terror. Here is your opportunity, your moment, to finally condemn the cold-blooded slaughter of over 1,000 innocent lives and the abduction of hundreds more in an act of pure terror. I hold no illusions. I have no expectations from the Council today. It has already made it clear that this International Day of Remembrance and Tribute does not apply to Israeli victims of terror. When future generations learn of this terrible period, they will look for the world's reactions to the evil committed against us. If they were only to look at the UN's response, they may not even know that Jews were massacred and kidnapped, because the United Nations cannot find the moral clarity to condemn these acts. Today, Israel fights on the front lines of the battle for civilization against terrorism and medieval barbarism. Our soldiers, our boys and girls in Gaza, they are fighting for their homes, for their families, their state, but it goes even deeper. They fight for the values and principles binding the entire liberal Western world. Today, it's Israel. Tomorrow, it can be everywhere. Distinguished colleagues, this war was forced upon us by men who called their parents to brag about having killed Jews, men who place military command centers and weapons of war underneath UNRWA schools and hospitals, men who hold innocent babies within terror tunnels for almost a year. We did not ask for this war. We are neither intentionally killing civilians nor overseeing a famine. There is no famine in Gaza. Since the start of the war, Israel has facilitated more than 14,000 trucks carrying aid, including over 700,000 tons of food. We also continue to work with our partners addressing the medical needs in Gaza. Between December 23 and January 24, enough polio vaccines for over 2 million Gazans were delivered, partnering with WHO and UNICEF. Between 95 to 99% of Gazans are already vaccinated. This campaign is taking place without any UNRWA involvement. As we speak, another comprehensive vaccine campaign is being launched for children under the age of 10. With all due respect to our allies, the Israel Defense Forces have always taken pride in being the most moral army in the world. In impossible conditions, Hamas knows that causing civilian casualties and depriving their own people of food will generate public outcry. So that is what they do. They're very good at that. They put civilians in harm's way and deprive them of the aid the international community has provided. Rather than condemn Hamas's outrageous abuse of its own people, international aid organizations like UNRWA and other organs of the UN have chosen to collaborate with Hamas. How can these bodies be part of the solution when they intensify the problem? How can they help build the future when they destroy the path to it? Israel looks to the future. The Abraham Accord showed the Arabs across the region want a different future. Development and prosperity, not endless wars and terrorism. The Abrahamic peace is paving the way to that future through regional integration and partnership, innovation and entrepreneurship. We stand ready to extend these accords to Middle Eastern partners. Many Gazans, many people in Gaza want that future too. But Gaza stands at a crossroads. The defeat of Hamas will enable Gazan civilians to chart their own destiny in partnership with the most successful countries in the region, with your support. Let me be clear, there is no future for the people of Gaza with Hamas left in control. There is no rebuilding of Gaza with Hamas in control. There is no future for the border communities in southern Israel with Hamas in control. The day after Hamas isn't something in the far-off future. It's a process that it is beginning right now as our forces fight for our security, for the return of our hostages, and for a better future for everyone in Gaza and Israel. For the sake of the Palestinians and Israelis alike, we cannot allow the next generation of Gazans to be raised to hate Jews more than they love their children. So long as Hamas and its hateful ideology rule in Gaza, Gazans will never have a chance for a decent life. So long as terrorists carrying rifles and suicide vests are entrusted to administer aid, terrorists will stay rich and civilians will remain poor. We Israelis need no lessons on how to strive and sacrifice for peace, but we have learned through bitter experience that true peace is not possible so long as entire generations are taught to hate. Mr. President, Israel has no desire to occupy Gaza. Once Hamas's defeat has been secured and our hostages have been safely returned home, we want Gazans to administer their own affairs. Gazans who are not compromised by terror or incitement and who are committed to peace with their neighbors. But instead of supporting these aspirations for peace and stability, this Council has become a forum for the world's most vile actors to sound off their hatred of Jews and Israel. I see the representative of the Palestinian Authority is still here. He has been sitting in that chair for 20 years. You have spent 2 decades in this place proposing resolutions which stir chaos, sow division, and avoid any hope. You have accomplished absolutely nothing but incite hatred and violence while claiming to be an advocate for peace. But I want to clarify an important point, and I demand an answer, Mr. Mansour. Who do you represent here today? Who you represent here today? Do you represent the Hamas terror organization? Since October 7th, you have delivered hundreds of speeches, yet you have never uttered anything even resembling a condemnation of Hamas. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anyone have heard any condemnation for the Hamas atrocities? Mr. Mansour, if you cannot condemn them, you are one of them. You do not represent the Palestinian people. Mr. Mansour, you are a terrorist in a suit. I demand you to condemn Hamas. If you do not condemn them, you are one of them. Mr. President, we all know the role of Iran in this conflict. They are the suppliers and mentors of the terrorist proxies attacking Israel from all sides. They are attempting to trigger a regional war. Just look at Lebanon. The Iranian regime has used its proxy Hezbollah to drive the country into economic and political ruin, transforming what was once the Paris of the Middle East into a terrorist haven. While we were still fighting the Hamas savages in our own homes and communities, on October 8th, day after the attack, Hezbollah began its attack. We did not target them. There was no immediate dispute. Yet they launched hundreds of rockets towards our civilians in the north. Have you considered in this council what was the reason for Hezbollah's attack against Israel? Let me remind you, Nasrallah himself announced that they had joined the war on October 8th. They did so to show support and sympathy for Hamas. Let me repeat, they did so to show support and sympathy for Hamas while they murdered Israeli civilians. That is the reason for Hezbollah to start the attacks against Israel. Since that day, thousands of rockets have been launched at our communities, targeting innocent Israelis, destroying their homes, and murdering children as they played soccer with their friends. Over 100,000 of our civilians remain displaced. Let me be very direct with you. We have our limits. We are not interested in escalation, but Israel will do whatever is necessary to restore security to the northern border, return northern residents to their homes, and remove the threat posed by Hezbollah. If you truly care for regional security, now, don't wait. Don't wait for something to happen. Now is the time to speak up, demand and ensure that Lebanon and Hezbollah fully implement Resolution 701. So we will not meet here in a month or in a week and discuss the escalation in Israel and Lebanon. Mr. President, this Council has a choice: continue down the path of moral ambiguity or stand up for what is right. Condemn terrorism in all its forms and uphold the values of peace, justice, and human dignity. Let me be clear. The days when Jewish blood was spilled and there was no response are over. The days when the Jewish people were at the mercy of tyrants are over. We are the captains of our own ship, and we will take all necessary steps against those who wish to harm us. The world is watching, and history will judge you by your actions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.